Colt Jameson's fist connected with the auctioneer's jaw, just as the man's gavel was coming down for the third and final time. The crack echoed through the crowded barn like a gunshot, and suddenly every soul in Willowbrook was on their feet, shouting and pointing as bodies tumbled off the makeshift platform. "Sold to?" The words died in Barnaby Kensington's throat as he hit the hay-strewn floor hard, his silk vest splitting at the seams. Blood trickled from his split lip as he stared up at the ranch hand who'd just cost him the biggest acquisition of his career. "The hell you sold anything?" Colt snarled, his calloused hands still clenched into fists. 26 years of honest labor had carved muscle into his frame, and right now every inch of it was coiled tight with fury. "That ranch ain't yours to sell, and you damn well know it." Behind him, Primrose Weatherby pressed her hands to her mouth, her cornflower blue eyes wide with shock and something else, hope, maybe, or terror. She stood frozen between her uncle's wheelchair and the chaos erupting around them. Her simple cotton dress, a stark contrast to the expensive suits of the land speculators who'd descended on their small, Missouri town like vultures. "Colt, stop," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the mayhem. The crowd surged forward as Kensington's hired men moved to protect their boss. These weren't local boys, they were hard cases from Kansas City, brought in specifically for this kind of trouble. But Colt had been expecting this fight for 3 months. Ever since word got out that the Weatherby Ranch was going up for auction to pay off debts, that shouldn't have existed in the first place. "You think you can waltz into our town and steal? What ain't yours?" Colt's voice cut through the noise as he hauled Kensington to his feet by his expensive lapels. "That girl's been working herself to the bone trying to save her family's land. On you." A meaty fist caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. One of Kensington's men, built like a bull and twice as mean, wrapped thick arms around Colt's chest from behind. But Colt had been wrestling steers since he was 12, and he knew how to break free from anything that tried to hold him. His elbow found soft flesh, and the man's grunt of pain was music to his ears. "Prim, get your uncle out of here!" Colt shouted over the growing brawl. More townspeople were picking sides, now the farmers and ranchers, against the city money men who'd been buying up property all along the valley. But Primrose wasn't moving. She stood transfixed, watching the man she'd grown up beside, the boy who'd taught her to ride and rope, who'd held her when her parents died, who'd worked their ranch for nothing but meals and a place to sleep, fighting for her like some knight. From the fairy tales her mother used to read, enough. Sheriff Daltrey's voice boomed through the barn as he fired his pistol into the air. "All of you, stand down." The fighting stopped as suddenly as it had started, but the tension remained, thick as molasses. Colt stood breathing hard in the center of it all, his shirt torn and knuckles bleeding, but his green eyes still blazing with defiance. "Colt Jameson," the sheriff said wearily, "you're under arrest." The jail cell smelled of old tobacco and broken dreams, but Colt barely noticed as he paced the narrow confines like a caged wolf. Through the barred window, he could see the auction continuing outside, and each fall of Kensington's gavel felt like another nail in Primrose's coffin. "You damned fool," Sheriff Daltrey muttered as he unlocked the cell door 3 hours later. "You know I can't hold you without charges, but that don't mean you did yourself any favors today." Colt's jaw tightened. "Tell me something I don't know, Ezra. How about this Kensington bought the ranch for half what it's worth? He's planning to tear down the house come Monday." The sheriff's weathered face was grim. "Word is he's got investors from back east who want to run cattle through here. To the railhead in Jefferson City. Big operation. For my dead body. That might just be what it comes to." Ezra stepped aside to let him pass. "Primrose is waiting for you at the church. Been there since they carried her uncle home." Colt found her sitting in the front pew, her golden hair catching the late afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. She looked small and lost in the vast space, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Prim," her name came. Out rougher than he intended, and she looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Oh, Colt." She was on her feet and in his arms before he could blink, her face pressed against his chest. They took it. They took everything. He held her tight, breathing. In the familiar scent of lavender and sunshine that had been driving him half crazy since they were teenagers, "It ain't over yet." She pulled back to look at him, and he saw something fierce flickering behind the tears. "Yes, it is." Uncle Jeremiah signed the papers. The debt was more than we thought. Apparently, Daddy had been borrowing against next year's crops for the past 5 years, and when the drought hit, she shook her head. We never had a chance. There's always a chance. Colt cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I've got some money saved up. It ain't much, but no. The word came out sharp as a blade. I won't let you throw your life away on a lost cause. You've already done enough, working our land for practically nothing all these years. You deserve better than to be dragged down with us. What I deserve, he said quietly, is to be standing right here, fighting for the woman I love. I've been waiting 20 years to say that, Prim, and I ain't about to stop now. Her breath caught. Colt, I know you got feelings for me too. I've seen the way you look at me when you think I ain't watching. It's the way you find excuses to bring me water when I'm working the south pasture. It's the way you lean into me during Sunday services. Color flooded her cheeks. That don't mean it means everything. He leaned down until their foreheads touched. Marry me, Primrose. Tonight, we'll figure out the rest as we go. With what money? What future? But her voice was weakening, hope creeping in despite her. Protests. Kensington owns everything now. The house, the barn, even the cattle. He owns the land. He don't own us. Colt's voice was steady. Sure, talk to Reverend Morrison on my way in here. There's ranches hiring up north. Good steady work with room for a married couple. We could start fresh and leave Willowbrook. Leave Uncle Jeremiah. Your uncle would want you to be happy. He's been telling me to court you proper for 5 years. Now, Colt's mouth curved in a slight smile. Besides, he's tougher than old boot leather. He'll be fine. Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour, and Primrose closed her eyes as if gathering her courage. When she opened them again, Colt saw his answer written there. Ask me proper, she whispered. The wedding was a simple affair. It's held by candlelight in the same church where they'd found each other hours before. Reverend Morrison spoke the words with quiet dignity while Uncle Jeremiah watched from his wheelchair, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Sheriff Daltrey and his wife served as witnesses, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store provided wildflowers, hastily gathered from her garden. But as Colt slipped his grandmother's thin gold band onto Primrose's finger, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Through the stained glass windows, he caught glimpses of movement in the shadows outside. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Morrison said with a smile. Colt leaned down to brush his lips against Primrose's, and the simple contact sent fire racing through his veins. She was his now, legally and completely, and he'd fight hell itself before he'd let anyone take her away. Congratulations, son. Uncle Jeremiah rolled his wheelchair forward, clasping Colt's hand in his gnarled fingers. Take care of my girl.
Out with
my life, sir. They were halfway to the door when it burst open, revealing Kensington and 3 of his hired guns. The auctioneer's face was purple with rage, and the bandage on his jaw only made him look more dangerous. Well, what do we have here? His cold eyes swept over the small gathering. A wedding. How? ... Touching. Get out. Colt stepped in, front of Primrose, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his gun would normally rest. But he'd left his weapons at the jail when he was arrested. I have business with the new Mrs. Jameson. Kensington's smile was all teeth and malice. You see, there's been a slight complication with the ranch sale. Primrose's hand found Colt's arm. What kind of complication? The kind where I discovered your dear departed father took out a second mortgage against the property. With me, personally, he produced a sheaf of papers from his coat, which means technically speaking, I've owned that ranch for the past 6 months. Today's auction was merely ... theater. The blood drained from Primrose's face. That's impossible, Daddy. Would never. Your daddy was a desperate man, drowning in debt, and too proud to ask for help. Sound familiar? Kensington's laugh was ugly. He came to me last fall, hat in hand, begging for money to save his crops. I was ... generous, in exchange for certain considerations. What considerations? Colt's voice was deadly quiet. The usual. Mineral rights, water rights, and... His gaze slid to Primrose like oil on water. A marriage contract. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dar. Primrose swayed on her feet, and Colt caught her arm to steady her. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" Kensington held up another document, this one sealed with red wax. "Betrothal agreement signed by your father and witnessed by 3 upstanding citizens of Kansas City. You were promised to me in marriage. Miss Weatherby? Or should I say, Mrs. Jameson?" Reverend Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Such contracts are illegal in the state of Missouri, and you know it. Legal, perhaps, but binding and certain, ... Business. Circles." Kensington's hired men shifted closer, hands resting on their gun butts. "I'm prepared to be reasonable about this unfortunate misunderstanding. The marriage can be annulled quietly, and Mrs. Jameson can fulfill her father's obligations. In exchange, I'll allow her uncle to remain in the house as caretaker." "And if we refuse?" Colt asked. "Then I'll have to collect my debt in other ways. Starting with foreclosure proceedings against every property in this town that owes money to the Cattleman's Bank, which incidentally I also own." His smile widened. "Amazing how many people are willing to sign papers when they're desperate." "Uncle?" Jeremiah's voice cut through the tension like a rusty blade. "You son of a bitch, you've been planning this for months. Years, actually. This little valley is going to make me very rich, and I won't let some ranch hand and his child bride stand. In my way." Kensington straightened his cuffs. "You have until dawn to decide, Mrs. Jameson. Choose wisely." As quickly as they'd come, Kensington and his men were gone, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the smell of fear. The abandoned line shack sat in the shadow of Devil's Ridge, 12 miles from town, and hidden by a stand of ancient oak trees. Colt had discovered it years ago while chasing strays, and now it served as their temporary sanctuary while they figured out their next move. "We can't hide forever," Primrose said softly, stirring the beans cooking over their small fire. She'd changed out of her wedding dress into practical riding clothes borrowed from Mrs. Henderson. But she still looked beautiful in the flickering light. "We ain't hiding," Colt replied, checking his rifle for the dozenth time. "We're planning." Gave him a look that said she wasn't fooled by his bravado. They both knew the truth. They were trapped between Kensington's lies and his very real power. The man had money, influence, and hired guns, while they had nothing but love and stubborn pride. "Maybe I should go back," she whispered, "if it would. Save Uncle Jeremiah and the town." "No." The word came out harsher than he intended, and Colt forced himself to soften his tone. "We'll find another way." "What other way?" "You heard him? He owns half the county, and he's willing to destroy everything to get what he wants." Tears sparkled in her eyes. Maybe Daddy did sign that paper. He was so desperate toward at the end, talking about debts and obligations I didn't understand. Colt set down his rifle and moved to sit beside her on the rough wooden crate that served as a bench. "Even if he did, it don't matter. You're my wife now, legal and proper. That trumps any business contract. Does it in Kansas City? With their laws and their lawyers." She leaned against his shoulder, and he could feel her trembling. "I'm scared, Colt. Not just for us, but for everyone. If he forecloses on those properties, then we'll make sure he can't." Colt's voice was grim with determination. "I've been thinking about what he said about owning the Cattleman's Bank. Banks keep records, paper trails, if he's been cheating. Folks, the way I suspect there'll be evidence." "And how exactly do we get to those records?" "Walk into Kansas City and ask nicely." Before Colt could answer, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. He was on his feet with the rifle in his hands before the echo faded, motioning for Primrose to get behind the thick log walls of the shack. But the voice that called out through the darkness was familiar and welcome. "Colt, it's Tobias Fletcher." Colt lowered his weapon as his old friend rode into the clearing. Followed by 2 other men he recognized from town, Doc Morrison's son Luke and Charlie Brewster from the feed store. "Toby," Colt clasped the man's hand as he dismounted. "Brings you out here?" "Troubles what?" Tobias was a man of few words, weathered by years of cowboying and Indian fighting. "Kensington's been busy since you two lit out. Foreclosed on the Henderson's store this afternoon, and he's got papers. Ready for 3 more properties? Luke Morrison stepped forward, his young face tight with anger. It ain't legal what he's doing, but he's got the sheriff in Jefferson City in his pocket. Local law can't touch him. There's more, Charlie added. Some of the boys have been asking questions about this cattleman's bank of his. Turns out it ain't even registered in Missouri. It's a shell company out of Chicago, backed by railroad money. Primrose emerged from the shadows, her face pale but determined. Oh, what does that mean? It means, Tobias said with grim satisfaction, that everything he's been doing here might not be legal under state law. But proving it's going to take time we don't have. Colt's mind was racing, pieces of a plan beginning to form. How many men can you round up? Men willing to fight? Depends on what kind of fight you're talking about. Tobias studied his friends. Face. You got something in mind? Maybe, but it's dangerous, and it might not work. Colt looked at each man in turn. Kensington thinks he holds all the cards, but he's made one big mistake. He underestimated how far folks will go to protect their own. What do you need us to do? Luke asked. Colt smiled for the first time since the auction. First thing we need to do is rob a bank. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of their fire and the distant cry of a night bird. Listening, Tobias, said finally. The Cattleman's Bank of Kansas City was housed in a modest brick building on 3rd Street. Unremarkable except for the ornate brass nameplate beside the front door. At 3 a.m, the street was deserted save for a few drunks stumbling home from the saloons and a lone police officer making his rounds. 6 blocks away, Colt crouched in the alley behind the building, his heart hammering against his ribs as he studied the rear entrance. Beside him, Tobias Fletcher adjusted the bandana covering the lower half of his face and checked his pocket watch. 5 minutes, he whispered. You sure about this plan? Sure as I can be. Colt's voice was muffled by his own mask. Luke and Charlie should be in position by now, once we get inside. We got maybe 20 minutes before the night watchman makes his next round. The lock on the back door was newer than the building itself, but Doc Morrison had taught his son well, and Luke had passed those lessons on to his friends. The tumblers clicked open with barely a whisper of sound inside. The bank was tomb quiet and smelled of leather and old paper. Colt moved through the darkness like a ghost, his boots silent on the polished wooden floors. He'd studied the buildings. Layout for 2 days, timing the guards and mapping every entrance and exit. Kensington's private office was on the 2nd floor, behind a door marked B.T. Kensington President. The lock here was even more sophisticated, but Colt had expected that. He produced a small vial of acid from his pocket, another gift from Doc Morrison's extensive chemical knowledge. Gan began working on the metal mechanism. Hurry up. Tobias hissed from the stairway. I heard something downstairs. The lock gave way with a soft click, and Colt slipped inside. Kensington's office was a monument to greed, with oil paintings of cattle and railroads covering the walls, and a massive safe squatting in the corner like a steel toad. But Colt wasn't interested in money, he was after something far more valuable. The filing cabinets were locked, but his acid made quick work of them too. Inside, he found exactly what he'd hoped for, folder after folder of loan documents, foreclosure papers, and business correspondence that painted a clear picture of Kensington's operation. The Cattleman's Bank wasn't just illegally chartered, it was a front for a massive land grab scheme backed by the Chicago and Eastern Railroad. Kensington had been systematically targeting small towns along the proposed route, using fraudulent loans and forged documents to seize properties that would be worth fortunes once the railroad came through. Got it, Colt whispered, stuffing the most damaging documents into a leather satchel. Among them was a copy of the supposed betrothal contract between Primrose and Kensington, along with a note in the man's own handwriting admitting it was a forgery. Company. Tobias's urgent whisper cut through the darkness. What? 2 men, coming up the stairs. Colt moved fast, relocking the filing cabinets and pocketing his vial of acid. Through the office window, he could see the rope Luke had secured to the roof their planned escape route. But as he reached for the sash, the office door burst open. Well, what do we have here? The voice belonged to one of Kensington's hired guns, a lean man with dead eyes and and a Colt .45 in his hand. Behind him stood the night watchman, looking nervous and overmatched. "Just a couple of rats," the gunman continued, his weapon trained. On Colt's chest, "Boss said you might try something stupid like this." Colt raised his hand slowly, the satchel still clutched in his left fist. "Seems like your boss knows a lot about rats, being one himself. It's funny. He'll enjoy hearing that." Before he puts a bullet in your skull, the gunman took a step closer. "Drop the bag." "Can't do that, friend. It's got something your boss needs to see. The only thing he needs to see is your dead body." The hammer clicked back on the Colt. Last chance. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but would be talked about in Kansas City saloons for years to come. Tobias Fletcher, moving with the speed and silence of a born predator, appeared behind the gunman like a ghost. His Bowie knife found the soft spot between the man's neck and shoulder, and he crumpled without a sound. The night watchman started to shout. The Colt's fist caught him in the jaw, dropping him unconscious beside his companion. "Time to go, Tobias," said, wiping his blade clean. They were out the window and down the rope before the bodies hit the floor, disappearing into the maze of Kansas City's back alleys with their precious cargo intact. Behind them, the cattleman's bank stood silent and innocent under the starlight, keeping its secrets for a few hours more. By dawn, they were 20 miles outside the city, riding hard for home with evidence that would destroy Barnaby Kensington and his empire of lies. But Colt knew their real fight was just beginning. The courthouse in Willowbrook had never seen a crowd like this. Every seat was packed, and folks stood 3 deep along the walls, their faces grim with purpose. Judge Cornelius Fairweather, normally a man of infinite patience, was struggling to maintain order as voices rose and tempers flared. "Order? I'll have order in my courtroom." The gavel banged repeatedly. But it was Primrose Jameson who finally silenced the crowd. She stood at the front of the room in her best blue dress, her golden hair pinned up proper, looking every inch the respectable, married woman she'd become. In her hands were the documents Colt had risked his life to steal, and her voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, I have evidence that Mr. Kensington has been operating illegally in this county for over 2 years. Evidence of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud the citizens of Missouri." Kensington shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is preposterous. Those documents were illegally obtained through breaking and entering."
Were they?
"Indeed." Judge Fairweather's weathered face was thoughtful as he examined the papers. "And how, pray tell, would you know they were illegally obtained unless you knew where they came from?" The courtroom erupted in laughter and scattered applause. Kensington's lawyer, a nervous man from Kansas City, tugged at his client's sleeve, whispering urgently. Furthermore, Primrose continued, her confidence growing with every word, "I have here a copy of the supposed betrothal contract between myself and Mr. Kensington, along with his own handwritten admission that it was forged for the purpose of coercing me into an illegal marriage." She held up the damning document, and the crowd's murmur turned ugly. In farming communities, a man's word was everything, and forgery was considered one of the lowest crimes possible. Judge Fairweather studied the papers with growing interest. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Jameson. Do you have witnesses to support these claims?" "I do, Your Honor." Colt stood from his seat in the front row, still bearing bruises from his fight at the auction. "I witnessed Mr. Kensington threaten Mrs. Jameson with foreclosure proceedings against innocent families if she didn't comply with his demands. And I can testify to the fraudulent nature of the loans," added Doc Morrison, rising from his seat. "I've examined the signatures on several documents, and they don't match the supposed signatories." One by one, other townspeople stood to offer their testimony. Charlie Brewster spoke about impossible interest rates and changing terms. Mrs. Henderson described pressure tactics and threats. Luke Morrison presented a detailed analysis of the bank's illegal charter status, but it was Uncle Jeremiah who delivered the killing blow. The old man rolled his wheelchair to the front of the courtroom, his weathered hands steady as he produced a worn leather journal from his lap. "Your Honor, I kept detailed records of every transaction my late brother made with outside creditors, including this."
Oh.
3 witnesses present when my brother specifically stated he would never mortgage the family land, not even to save the crops. Said he'd rather lose everything honest than win it through debt. Kensington's face had gone white. That proves nothing. Old men forget. I ain't done talking. Jeremiah's voice cut through the interruption like a blade. I also have here a letter from my brother, written 2 weeks before he died, asking me to make sure nobody ever tried to claim he'd signed papers giving away his daughter or his land to any man. He handed the letter to Judge Fairweather, whose eyebrows rose as he read. This letter is dated and witnessed by 3 people, including Reverend Morrison. It explicitly states that no marriage contracts or additional mortgages were authorized by the deceased. The courtroom fell silent as the weight of the evidence settled over them. Kensington's empire of lies was crumbling before their eyes, and everyone could see it. Judge Fairweather set down the papers and fixed Kensington with a steely stare. Sir, based on the evidence presented, I hereby invalidate all foreclosure proceedings initiated by the Cattlemen's Bank in this county. Furthermore, I'm ordering a full investigation into your business practices and referring this matter to the federal authorities. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the judge wasn't finished. As for the matter of Mrs. Jameson's marriage, I find her union with Mr. Colt Jameson to be legal and binding, entered into freely and without coercion. Any claims to the contrary are hereby dismissed. Kensington was on his feet, his face purple with rage. This isn't over. You have no authority to what I have, Judge Fairweather said quietly. Is a federal marshal waiting outside this courthouse with warrants for your arrest? I suggest you come quietly. As the lawmen moved in to take Kensington into custody, Colt wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her close as the courtroom celebrations swirled around them. They'd won not just the battle for their love, but the fight for their entire community. But the best was yet to come. 6 months later, Colt stood on the porch of the house he'd built with his own hands, watching the sun set over the valley that now belonged to him and Primrose in more ways than one. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen window, where his wife was entertaining their neighbor women with stories of their adventure in Kansas City, the Weatherby Ranch now. The Jameson Ranch stretched green and fertile before him, the cattle fat and healthy in the summer pasture. The drought had finally broken, and with it, the desperate times that had made men like Kensington possible. Admiring your kingdom? Uncle Jeremiah rolled his wheelchair onto the porch, a glass of lemonade in his gnarled hands. Admiring my good fortune, Colt replied with a smile. Sometimes I can't believe it all worked out. Of course it worked out. You fought for what was right. Jeremiah took a sip of his drink and gazed out over the land. Your daddy would have been proud, son. He always said you had the heart of a warrior and the soul of a poet. Colt's throat tightened. His parents had died in the cholera epidemic when he was 15. Leaving him alone in the world until the Weatherbys had taken him in, he'd spent so many years feeling like an outsider, working their land but never truly belonging. Now it was his home in every sense of the word. Speaking of warriors, Jeremiah continued, you hear what happened to Kensington? Last I heard, he was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The railroad company disavowed all knowledge of his schemes and paid restitution to everyone he'd swindled. Colt's expression darkened slightly. Though I suspect there are more like him out there, waiting for the next opportunity. Come. This town knows how to handle land grabbers now. The screen door creaked open behind them, and Primrose stepped onto the porch, her face glowing with happiness and something else, a secret she'd been carrying for weeks but hadn't found. The courage to share. The ladies are gone, she announced, settling into the rocking chair beside Colt's. Mrs. Henderson brought news from town. The railroad's definitely coming through Jefferson City instead of here. Seems they decided our valley's too geographically challenging for their purposes. Colt laughed. Oh, best news I've heard all week. Means we can raise our children in peace. Primrose's hand moved instinctively to her still flat belly. About that. ... Both men turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks warm under their intense scrutiny. Saw Doc Morrison this morning. Turns out there might be a little Jameson joining us come spring. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then Colt was out of his chair and sweeping her into his arms, spinning her around the porch while she laughed and protested about making her dizzy. "A baby," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "Prim, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. Doc says all the signs are there." She pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing wonder and joy and a fierce protectiveness that made her heart skip. "Are you happy? Happy?" Colt set her down gently, his hands framing her face. "Woman, I'm so happy I could bust. We're gonna have a family, Prim. A real family." Uncle Jeremiah cleared his throat from his wheelchair. "Well, I suppose this calls for something stronger than lemonade. Colt, there's a bottle of whiskey in the pantry that I've been saving for a special occasion." As the old man wheeled himself inside to fetch the liquor, Colt and Primrose stood together on their porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of possibilities and promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Primrose asked softly. "Giving up your dreams of seeing the world beyond this valley?" Colt's arms tightened around her. "My world is right here. You, our baby, this land, it's everything I ever wanted, even when I was too young and stupid to know it. Even though I come with a cranky old uncle and a mortgage, especially because of the cranky old uncle, someone's got to keep us honest." He brushed a kiss across her temple. "Besides, the mortgage got paid off with the reward money from turning in Kensington's operation. We're free and clear, Mrs. Jameson." They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of their valley cattle lowing in the distance. Night birds calling from the oak trees, the gentle whisper of wind through the prairie grass. It was a symphony of home, of belonging, of love triumphant over greed and corruption. "I love you, Colt Jameson," Primrose whispered into the gathering darkness. "And I love you, Mrs. Jameson, forever and always." Behind them, Uncle Jeremiah emerged with the whiskey and 3 glasses, ready to toast the future of the family that had fought for their right to exist. Outside, the Missouri stars shone down on the valley where love had conquered all, and where a new generation would soon carry on the legacy of courage and devotion that had made it all possible. The ranch hand had fought the auctioneer and won. Far more than just the girl he'd loved since childhood, he'd won a future worth fighting for.